Hi, it's Mark Coopersmith. And in my ongoing series of conversations with entrepreneurs, innovators, people who are making a big dent in the world, making positive change happen, it's really a pleasure to spend some time today with Tim Smith. Tim, thanks for joining. How are you?
You got it. I'm great, Mark. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. So we're going to do a couple of videos with Tim around the topic of prototyping, how to do it, what it is, why you do it, a number of things like that. So to do this, I want to introduce Tim's background, which is really plays upon this. Tim is the partner of portfolio operations at B Partners, a early stage venture capital firm. And it's a pleasure for me to be doing this in part because I'm also a limited partner in the fund, full disclosure. Uh, and as such, Tim works with pretty much all of the early stage companies that B Partners invests in. I'm just
Right.
going to give a little more context and then flip it back to you, Tim. Tim also has just a rich history in creating cutting edge projects and products with new and emerging technologies. So Tim, I guess framing it for right now, what do you do as the portfolio operations partner at B Partners? Kind of what do you do? Who do you work with? How do you do it? All of those things.
All right. So there's kind of two paths into venture capital. One is you do the Wall Street thing and you're private equity, whatever. You're just kind of a data wonk and you end up in venture capital. The other more interesting path to me is are those partners that come up through founding companies. So I'm an 8-time founder, and the vast majority of my experience has been building products, primarily software, a little bit of hardware. But at some point, your wife won't let you make any more companies, so you kind of end up in venture capital. That's where I am now.
Yeah. This is part of the 12-step program, and it's probably
That's right.
not working,
I'm on
right?
step 4 now.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'm in charge of portfolio operations, and that means a really kind of singular focus on our companies. We've got 43 some odd active portfolio companies. We've invested in 66 overall, and my job is to get these companies from kind of 0 to 1. And we've got, we're the first check in probably 70–80% of the companies that we invest in. So we're the
At least the first institutional check,
first institutional check, right? Beyond friends and family, and credit cards.
Yeah.
So these are nascent firms. In some cases, we're betting on a PowerPoint deck. In some cases, we got a fully formed product that's ready to go to market. In all cases, though, we're very early stage. We have a very high matriculation to Series A, which is very fortunate. And I think that's due to our curation and the very hands-on approach that we have with these companies. But to answer your question, Mark, it's really what I do is I do a lot of red teaming. I do a lot of criticism, very friendly fire. Yeah. But I look really closely at product and the process by which these early teams, many of these are first-time founders. Yeah. These early teams approach product development, and there are a lot of mistakes that they make that I've learned the hard way with a lot of arrows in my back that we try to impart, a better path forward so they can get to that Series A and beyond. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about across these 2 videos as well.
Perfect. So we're going to use that as our stepping off point. One thing I do want to say, which is one of the things I really appreciate, is you and your partners are also known as a very founder friendly venture capital firm. You get in early, you provide that kind of support. So for entrepreneurs that are watching this, just for what it's worth, you want to find, for those early investors in particular, founder friendly firms that really understand all of the challenges that early stage founders have. And one of those challenges is coming up with products that your customers actually want to build. And so that's kind of my segue into this first of our 2 videos. The first video, the one we're going to do right now, is talking about what is prototyping, rapid prototyping, why do founders do it, why do you need it? So with that in mind, what is it and why do you really start focusing right there with your founders on this?
Okay, well, let's talk about prototypes are not products. Let's be really clear, and let's try to diffuse some misconceptions about prototyping. Prototypes are not V1 or the alpha version of your product per se, and this is a really kind of hard step for many founders to get across, which is the whole point of prototypes is to, and we'll talk a lot about this today, is to bite off small chunks of the larger problem you're trying to solve those incrementally and very rapidly, and iterate super fast. And you're going to get a lot of no's. You're going to get a lot of no's from people you test with. You're going to be a lot of people saying, don't like it yet. But it's that iteration and that fast cycle time that gets you to something approximating product market fit. And the mistakes that we see.
Okay, let me break one question. We're going to talk about mistakes in a second. If you say
Okay.
prototypes aren't products, what are they?
They are prototypes, and they are meant to be, and this is a bit paradoxical as well, they should be disposable. So you have to consider prototypes in terms of an object that you don't fall in love with. It's a material object that its sole purpose in life is to prove a point, is to prove out a user story that is successful and gets traction so that you can build it in the target environment that you're working for. So these are meant to be really easy to make, really fast to test, and really fast to iterate before you get to the really expensive stuff, which is writing a lot of code to build the final product.
Yeah, so you want to throw them out. Now, you said that we were about to go into some of the mistakes that a lot of founders and entrepreneurs make.
Yeah. Well, one mistake is, and we've learned this the hard way, both by looking at our own portfolio companies, but even more evocatively, Mark, you and I have been at the Skydeck Accelerator at Cal for many years, 6, maybe 7 at this point for me, more for you. And what you see there with every cohort of these very young accelerator companies and hot desk companies is they tend to go off in the corner of Skydeck for sometimes months at a
long time, yeah,
and burnish that product amongst themselves. And you get into this groupthink and the blinders on, and everybody loves their product, and they really haven't had the reality check of taking any part of that product out on an incremental basis and test it against reality,
right?
And get that feedback. And that's what drives a product. That's what drives product market fit, is not whether your team likes it, not whether your mom likes it. It's whether a target customer likes it, not even a rando out on, out in the street. It's got to be somebody that would be a legitimate purchaser of your product down the road at some point.
All right. So in the spectrum of moving from just an idea to a prototype to all the way to product market fit, when we launch startups and we use kind of lean startup type methodology, we also talk a lot about MVPs, or minimum viable products. So the last thing, kind of from a definitional standpoint, is what's the difference between a minimum viable product versus a full product versus a prototype?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. Here's my definition. A prototype is meant to be disposable. A minimum viable prototype is, by my definition, it's the first functional version of a product that you can actually potentially deploy. Let me bring up a chart here. This is one of my favorite diagrams from the Sprint book by Google Ventures, which we're going to be talking about in the workshops. I highly recommend this book. It's probably the most concise definition of good Sprint, quality. And this Goldilocks chart I love so much because it's so simple. And the point here is really the benefits you can gain in testing and bringing something to reality that you can test in a very short time frame. They can be very high. That's the steep part of this curve here. At some point, though, you hit this point of diminishing returns, what I call asymptotically approaching bullshit. And if you go beyond this curve, you're kind of wasting your time and possibly yours and my money in further burnishing this idea. So the point here, and this is what this diagram very simply portrays here, is the minimum viable, notice I say prototype, not product.
Right.
The minimum viable prototype, you build it fast, it does something very focused, you get the feedback, you fix it, you iterate till it's good, then you move on to the next module.
Got it. So speed is one of the things that's really important when you're talking about this kind of speed, and you just don't want too much fidelity. You want it good enough just to get that feedback, that test, the ability to test it. Is that right?
Yeah, nothing more. And let me give you an example. Everybody knows about design thinking. It's a big movement, and it has a huge amount of value at the very, very earliest stage of brainstorming about product development. At some point, though, it kind of drops off. You really can't do much with a paper prototype, which is kind of that's the climax of a design thinking sprint, really. When you get into legit prototypes, you are confusing reality. You are presenting something that is faux reality. It's almost like those towns in the movies that are just the facades in the old Westerns, right? It's got to be real enough that the person you're testing your product with isn't telling you how to fix the prototype. They're telling you how to refine your product. And that's a very subtle distinction there that you have to make.
All right. So when we talk about how entrepreneurs use prototypes and then they'll evolve into minimum viable products from that,
Yes.
it's to do what? You want to use your prototype to,
It becomes a living specification.
yeah.
In the old days, I'm old enough to know that back in the mainframe days, and I worked on an IBM 360 back in the day, nobody knows what those are anymore. When you wrote a program in COBOL or SAS for an IBM 360, the requirements were a giant stack of written documents without even any diagrams in them.
Right.
And so the room for misinterpretation by designers, well, there weren't any back then, mostly developers, it's a huge thing. A great prototype, especially if you do it in a platform that's designed for sharing with dev teams, product managers, designers, everybody, it gathers them around the true vision of the product in pretty real ways. So,
Okay, so let me just build on that, because
yeah,
I thought we were thinking about prototypes as things that you bounce off potential customers or partners.
that's right.
You're talking about there's a number of different stakeholders that you've got to make sure that your
That's right.
prototypes get exposed to.
Yeah, that's a great point, a great distinction. So when you think about testing, everybody immediately says, well, I'm going to test with a customer. Nobody thinks about sharing this. What is the impact and the potential benefit of sharing prototypes with your internal team? And let me tell you why. So if you're sharing a prototype with your dev team, this disambiguates a huge amount of questions, right? How does it work? How fast does this move? What happens with these layers? It's all clear as a bell on there. It becomes a living spec. Sharing it with your design people just the other way is, oh, this is what the dev team means by doing X. Right. Sharing with your product managers or even your salespeople as they roll out to support, as you're iterating through multiple versions of your product. These are all living, breathing documents that are physical manifestations, realistic manifestations of what you're building, not just visually, but interactively as well, because we have the tools that can do that sharing with civilians. Yeah. That can emulate interactivity and that can emulate high resolution graphics.
Yeah, when we were chatting just before we turned this on, we were saying, well, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, ... And then you were just kind of, you were ranting on that. Go ahead.
Well, prototype is worth, a million. It's like, I'm a visual thinker. Some people are better with words, but I've always been a visual thinker. And whenever I've defined a specification for design and development teams, it's always been a visual interactive piece, all the way going back to HyperCard and before, back in the day.
Yeah, no, and that is so true. I mean, there have been times when we've all thought we were working on the same thing, and somebody says, "Here it is," and you look at it and you go, "That's not what I was thinking about."
That was within my head. That's right.
Yeah, and you want to hit that early rather than later, before we started spending some of that B partners money on building the wrong products, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, some products or offerings are going to be a lot easier than others to prototype when we start thinking about prototypes. And again, we're going to do the how-to a little bit later, but software or web services or something like that versus hardware. So should we only think about prototyping certain types of products? And maybe you can give us a few examples kind of across the spectrum.
I'd like to suggest that you can prototype anything. And I think the benefits are there for prototyping anything. I'll give you a couple examples. You can prototype hardware. Cardboard is miraculous. Masking tape, duct tape.
That is so analog. Duct tape and cardboard? It
works great, man. And especially if you're looking at a hybrid environment, it can do wonders. I'll never forget looking at, there was a student presentation at Jacobs on campus at Cal a couple of years ago. They were trying to envision what autonomous cars were like. What do you do in cars when they're fully autonomous? And the kids had built a full cardboard kind of mock-up of a car. You could get in it and think, oh, wait, I can turn backwards against the highway and watch a movie.
Right.
It's that kind of context that is just good enough to make you come to conclusions that you might not otherwise. Let me give you another one. We often get pitched by teams that are trying to show us, even if it's a prototype, it's not really real, but they try to boil the ocean. They try to do everything in the pitch, meaning the functional pitch as well as the visual aesthetic pitch.
So where should
I always
you start?
encourage them. What's that?
Where should you start? How do you balance that? I mean, how do you know where to start when you don't know where you're going to end up?
Well, I tell you a trick is to separate those two. And I'll tell you, as an investor, if someone comes to pitch us and they have a very complex idea that has both visual UX component and functional component, let's say it's ML or AI or something really kind of technological advanced, uh, show me the functional part if you've started to work on it as a command line interface. Put in some variables, get me a response. Okay, it works. Now show me the vision for what the visual looks like or the user experience. Is it going to go to a farmer that has a high school education? I don't care. Tell me that story. They don't have to be working together yet. You're coming to me for funding to combine these things. And that's kind of a thing that, you know, these folks pitching these things don't often think about. I can separate those two and make it much easier to present.
So that's an interesting question. So a lot of times we think that, when we're going to go start pitching an early stage venture firm, we need to have that prototype. In a lot of cases we do. Everybody says, look, show me product, show me traction, show me product market fit.
Yep.
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But what fidelity do you look for in prototypes? Kind of, when we think about its role in the fundraising process.
You know what, Mark? To be perfectly honest, we're more looking at the stage we invest in, which is so early. We're more looking at the body language and the confidence of the team.
Right.
And a lot of the confidence of the team that we can build something here is often veiled by an over exuberant presentation. That it sounds paradoxical and weird, but it's the people who come in with a really pragmatic approach, and it's more about, we know exactly how to do this. And again, back to my example, here's our command line interface that shows we're hitting the server, we're coming back with this logic. But over here, we just want to know that you can build technically what you're trying to do, and you can build aesthetically to the extent you need to what you want to build. Because too often we'll get the gearhead engineers that have no idea what UX is, or we have the brilliant designers who have no idea how to build a product technically. And we really can't do anything with that. We need both sides for most of the investments we make.
So how does this process help bring those sides together?
Well, look, one, let's take coming to be partners to begin with, and let's say a prototypical team that first-time founders, they've never done this before. If they come and we like the team and they can demonstrate technical capability, they can demonstrate some understanding of aesthetics, that they have a real concern for the user experience. It's our job to fund them and then coach them how to go from there. Right. And that's when, frankly, the workshop we're talking about kicks in pretty hard, which is, okay, how do you prototype? How do you iterate? What's a sprint? How do you test? What signs you're looking for in testing? All the things that we may get into with the second video here.
Yeah. So one of the other things that you're kind of saying as well, this is why you're in on those meetings. Well, you're contributing to those investment decisions, I expect. And that is this a team that either has put some of these basic concepts into some fundamental prototypes, and or do we see the roadmap to get from where they are, their language, what they've been working, into these prototypes, into products? Is that right? You kind of need to see that trajectory.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that for a second. Let me see if I can bring up this is a graphic that I use a lot. And if you're in the workshop, you're going to see this, because this kind of is the Access Moon die for the whole presentation. We step through this process. And the key components of this process are, one, what is the vision here? And boy, I can talk about that at length, but let's just get the high level first. You have a vision for a product. You go into an iterative loop, which involves design, prototyping, testing, and iteration. At some point, you come out of that loop and you ship. And it's art to understand when you make that leap to ship. But to go back to vision, and we'll cover this off later, too often we don't even see the vision. And that's a red flag for us. And the vision should be provocative. It should be aggressive. It should be scary.
Right.
It should be virtually unattainable. That's what we really want to see. And then we want to see a very pragmatic, stepwise approach to try to reach that moon, because you're unlikely going to get there, but it better be a really high goal to start with, because you're going to be challenged along the way. It's going to degrade as we go through the process. But this is the loop.
Right. And by the way, as it's been said, good entrepreneurs, they know how to ship product, right? You don't over improve those products. And in that loop, by the way, I presume there are mini loops in each of those loops as well. You're iterating around prototypes, iterating around testing, iterating around design as well, kind of as you go through that circle, right?
Correct. And what happens is, you'll see, and in the workshop we can show it, I can show another screen later, but what it starts to look like an S curve. You'll definitely see this pattern. Yep. Where you'll start slow and you're not getting traction, you're getting a lot of no's to your testing, and then you'll latch onto something. You'll get some feedback. It's like, aha, That's what we've been missing. We're getting this feedback from multiple test recipients. Then you get a steep climb, and then you hit that asymptotic kind of, like we're tapering off, we're not getting a good return on all of our further investment. That's when you need to start thinking as a team, is it time to ship? And I would err on the side of shipping too early rather than too late on balance.
Right.
So that's
Unless,
the whole loop. This is the short loop, but there is an S curve where you're iterating through this over and over before you get to final product.
yeah, I guess the one thing that I might add to what you just shared is, if it's a web service or something like that, ship as soon as you can, because you can continue iterating on the fly.
That's right.
If it's hardware is perhaps a little bit tougher to ship too early. And especially if it's like an airplane, you do want to make sure that it works, right?
This is true.
Yeah,
right.
There we
but
are.
if you remember the days of CD-ROMs and Gold Masters, when you get your Photoshop V2 on a Gold Master, that's committed, man. And once it's there, it's going to have to work, blemishes and all, until the next version, next disc you get in the mail. Those days are gone.
So we can iterate super quickly. All right. As we think about wrapping this up, kind of two kind of key areas. Number one, if you were to think about just a couple things we didn't cover about the what is it, or why do we need to do it, or how do we use them, that as we've had this conversation, you said, oh yeah, there's a couple things I want to mention on top of that. And maybe we covered them.
I think we covered them. I guess if I had to, I was looking at my notes here. I guess if I had to summarize everything, it's a new landscape now. We have the tools now to allow anyone to create prototypes. I mean, the CEO down to the front desk secretary.
Right.
Anyone can do this stuff and share it, and you should. There are massive benefits to prototyping, well beyond the design thinking training that's so prevalent out there right now. You do need a North Star to the diagram that's still on the screen here. If you don't have a North Star, you're gonna sail around rudderless.
Okay. Well,
finally,
question. Yeah. And remember your finally. So important. What's your North Star? When you say you need it, is it what your technology is? Is it the problem you're solving? Is it some insight? What do you think your North Star is when you say, let's see if we can get that product market fit and use prototypes to get there?
It's kind of a combination of two things, Mark. It's a recognition of what the problem or the opportunity or both is.
Right.
Real clarity there, and why it's important and why it's worth some form of value to a customer. So clear understanding of what the problem is, and then a unique, provocative, different, not an incremental, but a really step function change that disrupts that solution. It could be existing solutions to that. You have to provide a step function solution to that.
Not
so
incremental.
It's the recognition of both. That's the North Star.
Love that. Okay. I'm going to close with it with actually, let me summarize that and then give you the last word of kind of key things you wanted to cover on. But what you just touched on, kind of where we are, is use that customer discovery, those conversations with your customers to get to the problem, not the solution side of things, right? Now you understand the problem. Prototyping is when you're going to start to say, is this starting to address that problem? As we look at that. So we're going to go back into the customer discovery, design thinking. Now we're making it real as far as kind of where this fits. All right. Any recap, kind of key things? What should we remember about prototyping?
Well, you said it pretty great. I mean, we've never had better tools. We've never had ever better collaborative tools to do what we can do now. It's pure magic. It doesn't take some special person to manipulate these tools. Anybody can do it. And so it's amazing to me that with each cohort that we see, for example, at Skydeck of a couple of hundred people, we have to emphasize this over and over. It's continually a surprise to me that we're not seeing much more experimentation in this regard, rapidly building prototypes, testing ideas, and throwing them away at a fast pace. That's what gets you to the product. Simple as that.
I think that's a perfect way to end it. So this is kind of part one of two. Now that we know what it is, why we do it, how we use it, we're going to, in our next conversation, Tim's going to share with us a little bit more about how to do it, how to create great prototypes and do it as quickly as possible. Tim, this was awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Anytime.